The US government has told some lies so big they needed budgets, uniforms, press conferences, and occasionally a terrified ambassador's daughter reading from a script. In this video, we're looking at 32 times official America said, "Trust us," while the truth was hiding in classified files, burned uniforms, fake attacks, secret bombings, poisoned air, and paperwork stamped top secret. 1. In March 1959, the Dalai Lama escaped Tibet after an uprising against Chinese rule collapsed. Publicly, the story was framed like a dramatic spiritual exodus. Monks, mountains, faith, courage, and absolutely no American fingerprints anywhere. Very clean. Very cinematic. Very convenient. Behind the curtain, though, the CIA had already been playing a much dirtier game. Starting in 1957, Tibetan fighters were recruited, flown all the way to Camp Hale in Colorado, trained in guerrilla warfare, and then dropped back into Tibet with radios, weapons, and a very American supply of plausible deniability. The agency funded resistance networks for years and helped coordinate operations against Chinese forces. CIA-trained operatives also helped secure parts of the Dalai Lama's escape route. The United States publicly acted like a concerned spectator, while secretly running a paramilitary side quest in the Himalayas. 2. Pat Tillman was the kind of American hero story the Pentagon could not believe it had been handed for free. A famous NFL safety leaves behind a $3.6 million contract after September 11th, joins the Army Rangers, goes to war, and then dies in Afghanistan. The official version came out fast and shiny. Tillman had supposedly charged uphill through enemy fire to protect his fellow soldiers. He received a Silver Star. His memorial was broadcast across the country. It was powerful, emotional, and almost entirely false. Tillman was killed by friendly fire during a confused firefight. Soldiers nearby knew it almost immediately. His uniform and body armor were burned. His family was kept in the dark. The government turned a tragic mistake into recruitment theater, then acted shocked when people were angry about being sold a patriotic movie trailer instead of the truth. 3. When the United States took the Philippines from Spain in 1899, President William McKinley wrapped the whole thing in the soft blanket of benevolent assimilation. America was not conquering anyone, of course. No, this was friendship with rifles. The official goal was to win Filipino respect, confidence, and affection while uplifting them, because apparently nothing says affection like military occupation. What followed was a brutal war that killed more than 200,000 Filipino civilians. American forces burned villages, created reconcentration zones, and used water torture so often it earned the cheerful little nickname, the Water Cure. Entire communities were emptied. Some commanders ordered extreme violence against whole populations. Back home, Americans were fed stories about grateful locals welcoming liberation. In reality, humanitarian language had been spray-painted over a campaign of destruction, and the paint was not even dry. 4. For decades, the United States government handled Area 51 with the subtlety of a child hiding behind a curtain with both feet visible. The official response was basically, "Area what? Never heard of it." Maps were altered. Airspace was locked down. Workers flew in on unmarked aircraft. Security was intense. Meanwhile, regular people were standing on nearby hills with binoculars, looking directly at the world's most famous, non-existent military base. Area 51 began in 1955 as a testing site for the U-2 spy plane, then later hosted other secret aircraft programs like the SR-71 Blackbird and stealth technology. The CIA only officially admitted the place existed in 2013 after declassified documents were released through a Freedom of Information request. That is nearly 60 years of denying a base people could practically point to from the desert. The real secret was never the location. It was what they were testing. 5. After the September 11th attacks, workers and residents in Lower Manhattan needed one answer more than anything else. Was the air safe? On September 18th, EPA Administrator Christine Whitman gave the reassuring message everyone wanted to hear. The air quality was safe, she said. People could return. Rescue work could continue. What a comforting sentence, except for the tiny problem that it was dangerously untrue. The air around Ground Zero was loaded with asbestos, lead, mercury, benzene, pulverized concrete, and other toxic material. Internal documents later showed that the White House pushed the EPA to sound reassuring, partly to get Wall Street moving again. First responders spent months breathing poison with inadequate protection because officials told them it was fine. Thousands later developed cancer and severe respiratory diseases. The government did not just fail them, it handed them a false sense of safety with official letterhead. 6. On October 25, 1983, the United States invaded Grenada, a small Caribbean island with about 90,000 people, which is roughly the size of a military footnote. President Reagan sold the invasion as a heroic rescue mission. American medical students were supposedly in danger after a coup, and U.S. troops had to save them from communist chaos. It was simple, emotional, and perfect for television. The problem was that the head of St. George's University Medical School publicly said the students were not in immediate danger. The new Grenadian authorities had offered to protect them and help arrange evacuation. Some students were nervous, sure, but nervous is not the same as needs a full-scale invasion. The real concern was that a Cuban-aligned government might strengthen its position. But "we dislike this government" sounds imperial. "We are saving students" sounds heroic, so the students became the marketing department. 7. In January 1893, American sugar planters in Hawaii decided that Queen Liliuokalani was bad for business, which in colonial politics usually meant she was about to have a very bad week. These businessmen wanted power, lower tariffs, and a government more friendly to plantation profits. But overthrowing a queen looks ugly, so U.S. Minister John Stevens helped manufacture a crisis. He claimed American lives and property were in danger, even though there was no real evidence of such a threat. Then he called Marines from the USS Boston ashore. 162 armed troops appeared near the royal palace, and the Queen surrendered under protest to avoid bloodshed. Stevens quickly recognized the planter-led provisional government. President Grover Cleveland later investigated and called the overthrow illegal, even describing it as an act of war. Congress ignored him. 5 years later, Hawaii was annexed. A kingdom was taken with fake danger and very real guns. 8. During the 1960 presidential campaign, John F. Kennedy hammered the Eisenhower administration over the so-called missile gap. He warned that the Soviet Union had raced ahead with hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles while America was falling behind. It was terrifying, dramatic, and politically useful, which is the holy trinity of campaign fear. Voters heard that the country was exposed to nuclear danger, and Kennedy rode that anxiety straight into office. Then he received the classified intelligence. Surprise! There was a missile gap, but it favored the United States. America had a huge lead in nuclear delivery systems, while the Soviets had only a handful of operational intercontinental missiles. Eisenhower had known this but could not reveal the proof without exposing spy plane intelligence. Kennedy either repeated a falsehood without checking it or used it because it worked. Either way, nuclear panic became campaign fuel, and fear helped win an election. 9. From 1969 to 1973, Richard Nixon repeatedly told Americans and Congress that the United States respected Cambodia's neutrality. The war was in Vietnam, he insisted. Cambodia was not part of the plan. Very official, very calm, completely false. The Air Force was secretly carrying out Operation Menu, a bombing campaign that dropped more than 500,000 tons of explosives on Cambodia. Missions were hidden behind falsified flight records. Reports were altered or destroyed. Congress was not properly informed. When journalists exposed the bombing, Nixon and Henry Kissinger reacted not with honesty, but with illegal wiretaps to hunt the leakers. The bombing killed civilians, destabilized the country, and helped create the chaos that allowed the Khmer Rouge to rise. Nixon was not merely concealing a few missions. He was hiding a secret war, and the bill came due in blood. 10. Starting in the Cold War, the CIA built a cozy and deeply disturbing relationship with parts of the media world through efforts often associated with Operation Mockingbird. The public imagined newspapers and broadcasters as independent watchdogs. Meanwhile, intelligence officials were recruiting journalists, editors, publishers, and foreign media contacts like the news business was a giant chessboard. Some cooperated for money. Others did it for access or patriotism. The CIA funded magazines, student groups, cultural organizations, books, and propaganda outlets. Stories could be planted. Narratives could be nudged. Foreign journalists could be encouraged to print America's preferred version of reality. When the Church Committee hearings exposed these relationships in the 1970s, Americans learned their free press had not always been as free as advertised. The CIA later claimed it cleaned up the program. Sure, because intelligence agencies are famously excellent at saying, "Yes, we are done manipulating things now." 11. On July 9, 1962, the United States detonated a 1.4 megaton nuclear bomb about 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. The test was called Starfish Prime because apparently even space nukes need cute names. Officials presented it as a scientific experiment to study high-altitude nuclear effects. What they did not advertise was that nobody fully understood what would happen when you detonated a thermonuclear device in space like a toddler pressing the big red button. The explosion produced a massive electromagnetic pulse. Streetlights in Hawaii, nearly 900 miles away, went out. Several satellites were damaged or destroyed, including Telstar, America's brand new communication superstar. Radiation from the blast formed an artificial belt around Earth that lingered for years. Scientists had warned about risks to satellites in the atmosphere. The government pushed the button anyway, then acted surprised that nuking space had consequences. 12. In 1954, the United States detonated the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll, and the blast turned out more than twice as powerful as expected. That is not a tiny math error. That is the nuclear version of "Oops, we made a second sun." Radioactive fallout drifted over inhabited islands that were supposed to be safe. People on Rongelap Atoll suffered burns, hair loss, and radiation sickness. Then the story became even darker. Instead of permanently relocating them, officials later allowed residents to return to contaminated land while telling them it was safe. Project 4.1 was created to study the effects of fallout on human beings. For decades, Marshall Islanders were monitored as they developed thyroid disease, cancers, birth defects, and miscarriages. They were treated less like citizens of a human world and more like living lab notes. The reassurance was fake. The suffering was very real. 13. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved one of the most insane plans ever typed onto government paper, Operation Northwoods. The concept was not subtle. Stage terrorist attacks, fake or possibly real, blame Cuba, and use the outrage to justify an invasion of Fidel Castro's island. The proposals included sabotaging ships, staging attacks on refugees, creating violent incidents in American cities, and even faking the destruction of a civilian aircraft. Yes, the highest military leadership in the United States seriously floated domestic terror as a public relations strategy for war. The plan reached President Kennedy, who rejected it. Good call, because "let us attack ourselves and blame Cuba" is not exactly a normal Tuesday policy memo. The documents stayed buried for decades until they were declassified in the 1990s. The scariest part is not that the plan existed. It is that adults in uniforms signed it. 14. In October 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl known only as Nayirah gave emotional testimony before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. She said Iraqi soldiers had stormed a hospital in Kuwait, ripped premature babies from incubators, and left them to die on the floor. The story was horrifying. It was repeated by politicians, media outlets, and President George H.W. Bush as evidence of Iraqi brutality. It also turned out to be a staged public relations weapon. Nayirah was actually the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the United States. Her testimony had been coached by Hill and Knowlton, a PR firm hired by the Kuwaiti government for nearly $11 million. Investigations later found the incubator massacre did not happen as described. By then, the emotional damage was done. A fake atrocity story had helped build support for war. It was propaganda with tears, lighting, and a very expensive invoice. 15. In 1918, a deadly influenza strain spread across the world while the United States was still deep in World War I. President Woodrow Wilson had pushed through the Sedition Act, making it dangerous to criticize the government or say anything that might damage wartime morale. Public health officials understood the flu was catastrophic. The federal government still stayed dangerously quiet. Wilson never publicly addressed the pandemic in a meaningful way. Newspapers were pressured into softening or suppressing bad news. Cities that should have been locking down were hosting patriotic Liberty Loan parades instead. Philadelphia packed roughly 200,000 people together in September 1918, and within days, its hospitals were overwhelmed. The government treated public honesty like a threat to morale, which is an impressive way to misunderstand both medicine and reality. Around 675,000 Americans died. Many never received clear warnings because the propaganda machine cared more about war enthusiasm than survival. 16. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. Army ran secret experiments over American cities to see how biological weapons might spread through urban populations. In St. Louis, planes and vehicles sprayed zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over neighborhoods, including poor public housing areas such as Pruitt-Igoe. Residents were told it was a test of a smokescreen that could protect cities from Soviet bombers. That sounds almost comforting, in the same way a wolf in a lab coat sounds comforting. In reality, the Army was studying dispersal patterns for potential biological agents. Zinc-cadmium sulfide was used because it was easy to trace, not because anyone had lovingly confirmed it was harmless. Cadmium is a known carcinogen. Later researchers raised concerns about health effects and cancer rates in sprayed areas. The government turned ordinary neighborhoods into test chambers and told the people inside they were being protected. 17. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military sprayed around 20 million gallons of herbicides across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The most infamous was Agent Orange, used to strip forests and destroy crops. Soldiers handled it, mixed it, sprayed it, walked through it, and washed in contaminated water while being told not to worry. It only killed plants, officials said. Very relaxing, except for the part where the chemical was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds ever made. Internal records from chemical companies showed they knew there were serious dangers. The government knew enough to be concerned too. Soldiers were not properly warned. Veterans later developed cancers, neurological disorders, immune problems, and other illnesses. The VA denied many claims for years. Vietnamese civilians suffered even more, with birth defects continuing across generations. Safe for humans was not a misunderstanding. It was a useful lie that kept the spraying going. 18. In April 1933, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for Americans to hoard gold coins, bullion, or gold certificates. Citizens had to hand over their gold to the Federal Reserve for $20.67 per ounce. Refusing could mean prison time and a massive fine. So people complied, because when the government says, "Sell us your gold or enjoy a decade in prison," that is not exactly a voluntary marketplace. Then, in January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act revalued gold to $35 per ounce. Beautiful timing. The government had forced citizens to sell low, then instantly made the gold worth about 70% more once it was safely in federal hands. Roosevelt called it economic stabilization. Maybe. But from the citizens' side, it looked a lot like legal confiscation with a government profit margin conveniently baked in. 19. In the 1960s, heart disease was rising fast in America, and scientists were trying to identify the villain. Some evidence pointed toward sugar. The sugar industry, calmly and responsibly, decided to buy a better answer. Internal documents revealed decades later showed that the Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard scientists to publish a review shifting blame away from sugar and onto dietary fat. Their work appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, with no funding disclosure required at the time. Then public health advice followed the "fat is the enemy" storyline. Americans spent years avoiding butter and eggs while eating low-fat products packed with sugar, because apparently removing fat and adding dessert dust was health. Obesity and diabetes climbed. One of the paid scientists later became a major nutrition official at the USDA. The fox was not just guarding the henhouse, it was writing the dietary guidelines. 20. When Private First Class Jessica Lynch was rescued from an Iraqi hospital in 2003, the Pentagon released a story so cinematic it practically came with theme music. She had supposedly fought fiercely, fired her weapon until the end, suffered gunshot and stab wounds, and endured abuse before being rescued in a dramatic commando operation. The media devoured it. A young blonde soldier from West Virginia became the perfect wartime heroine. Then, reality entered the room and ruined the script. Lynch's rifle had jammed. She had not fired at attackers. Her injuries came from a vehicle crash. Iraqi hospital staff had treated her and had even tried to return her to American forces. When U.S. troops arrived, there were no enemy soldiers guarding the hospital. The rescue footage looked dramatic because it was filmed that way. Lynch later testified that the story was false. The Pentagon had turned an injured, unconscious soldier into an action figure. 21. On November 17, 1973, Richard Nixon stood before hundreds of Associated Press editors and delivered the line that would follow him forever: "I am not a crook." He was talking about his finances, but the phrase became the unofficial theme song of Watergate. The problem was that Nixon was lying on a scale that required its own filing cabinet. He had approved hush money for the burglars. He had tried to use the CIA to block the FBI investigation. He had personally directed parts of the cover-up from the Oval Office. Unfortunately for him, he had also installed a taping system because nothing says criminal genius like recording your own conspiracy. When the Supreme Court forced him to release the tapes, the evidence became impossible to spin. 9 months after declaring his innocence, Nixon resigned. "Not a crook" became one of history's most famous self-owns. 22. After World War II, the United States launched Operation Paperclip, a secret program to recruit German scientists before the Soviet Union could grab them. The public version was about capturing brilliant minds for democracy. The private reality was messier and much uglier. Many of these men had worked for the Nazi regime. Some were Nazi Party members. Some were linked to forced labor, weapons programs, or human experimentation. Officially, people with serious Nazi ties were not supposed to be recruited. So the files were cleaned up. Membership records disappeared. War crime concerns were softened, ignored, or buried. About 600 scientists and their families were brought to America. Wernher von Braun, whose rocket program used concentration camp slave labor, became a celebrated figure in the U.S. space program. America did not just forgive former Nazi experts. It gave them careers, protection, and security clearances with a patriotic bow on top. 23. Thomas Jefferson built much of his political identity around strict constitutional limits. If the Constitution did not clearly give the federal government a power, then the government did not have it. Simple, elegant, very convenient until Napoleon offered to sell the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. Suddenly, Jefferson's strict principles started doing gymnastics. The Constitution did not explicitly say a president could buy a giant chunk of foreign land. Jefferson knew this and privately admitted the deal stretched his authority. But the bargain was absurdly good. He solved the problem by calling it treaty power, which sounded constitutional enough if everyone squinted. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States and reshaped history, but it also exposed a funny little truth about political principles. They are much easier to defend when nobody is offering you half a continent at clearance sale prices. 24. On December 4, 1969, Chicago police raided the apartment of Fred Hampton, the young chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party. The official story was a violent shootout. Police said Panthers opened fire, and officers simply responded. That version collapsed under forensic evidence. Police fired roughly 90 shots or more. The Panthers fired at most one, and possibly none. Hampton was shot in bed after an FBI informant had allegedly provided him with a sedative the night before. FBI records later showed COINTELPRO had targeted Hampton as a dangerous messiah figure because he was building alliances across racial and political lines. An informant had supplied police with the floor plan of the apartment. This was not a chaotic gun battle. It looked like a coordinated assassination followed by a cover story. The official lie blamed Panther aggression because the physical evidence told a much darker story. 25. In April 1961, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion crashed into disaster almost immediately. But before the failure became impossible to hide, Washington needed the world to believe this was not an American operation. So Ambassador Adlai Stevenson appeared before the United Nations with photographs of aircraft painted to look like Cuban Air Force planes. He said defecting Cuban pilots had bombed their own bases and joined the rebellion. Sounds dramatic. Also fake. The planes were American B-26 bombers, repainted with Cuban markings at CIA-linked facilities. The pilots were not defectors, they were part of the operation. Stevenson had not been told the truth by his own government, so he stood in front of the world confidently selling a lie he did not know was a lie. When he found out, he was furious and humiliated. The Kennedy administration had sacrificed its ambassador's credibility to protect a doomed cover story. 26. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. Before investigators could properly determine what happened, newspapers screamed that Spain was responsible. "Remember the Maine" became the national chant, and the country surged toward war. President McKinley did not have solid proof of Spanish involvement, but the political pressure was enormous. The Spanish-American War followed, and the United States took Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Later investigations raised a far less heroic possibility. The Maine may have been destroyed by an internal explosion, likely linked to a coal bunker fire, igniting the ammunition magazine. In other words, the spark that helped launch an American empire may not have been a Spanish attack at all. The government either believed bad evidence or leaned into a useful myth. Either way, empire arrived wrapped in a slogan and powered by a blast no one fully understood. 27. From 1967 to 1972, the U.S. military ran Operation Popeye over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The goal was to weaponize the weather, because apparently regular war was not dramatic enough. Air Force crews flew thousands of cloud-seeding missions, spraying silver iodide to extend the monsoon season and turn roads into mud. The idea was to slow enemy movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Officially, of course, nothing like this was happening. When reporters or foreign governments asked about weather modification, Pentagon officials denied it. Defense Secretary Melvin Laird told Congress there were no operational weather modification programs in Southeast Asia. That was false. The program was exposed after leaked documents reached the press. The scandal helped lead to an international treaty banning environmental modification as a weapon. The United States literally got caught trying to make it rain on command, then had to promise the world it would stop playing villain meteorologist. 28. In 1948, Italy held its first major democratic election after World War II, and the Communist Party was gaining real support. Publicly, the United States praised democracy and self-determination. Privately, the CIA treated Italian voters like a software problem that needed patching. The agency funneled money to the Christian Democrats, funded anti-communist propaganda, printed millions of pamphlets, backed films, planted stories, and helped create letters from Italian Americans warning relatives not to vote communist. There were also threats that U.S. aid could disappear if the wrong side won. The Christian Democrats won decisively, and the CIA had its first major covert political success. The template was born: celebrate free elections in speeches, then quietly manipulate them when the outcome looks inconvenient. Italy became the prototype for future operations across Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. America trusted democracy, apparently, as long as democracy picked the approved answer. 29. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat sank the British liner RMS Lusitania off Ireland, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The public story from Britain and the United States was clear. Germany had murdered civilians aboard an innocent passenger ship. The outrage helped push American opinion closer to entering World War I. But Germany had warned that the ship was carrying war materials and even placed newspaper notices telling passengers not to board. For decades, officials denied that the Lusitania had military cargo. Later evidence supported what historians had long suspected. The ship was carrying millions of rounds of rifle ammunition and other supplies. That does not make the human tragedy less awful, but it does make the purely innocent liner story much harder to defend. The governments involved sold a cleaner version because clean stories move public opinion faster than complicated truth. 30. In March 2013, Senator Ron Wyden asked Director of National Intelligence James Clapper a very direct question in a public Senate hearing. Did the NSA collect data on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? Clapper paused, touched his head, and answered, "No, sir, not wittingly." 3 months later, Edward Snowden leaked documents showing the NSA was doing exactly that. Programs collected data from major tech companies and gathered phone metadata on huge numbers of Americans. Clapper later described his answer as the least untruthful thing he could say in public, which is an elite-level phrase for "I lied," but with government seasoning. He was not prosecuted. Snowden, the person who exposed the surveillance, was charged under the Espionage Act and fled the country. The man who revealed the lie became a fugitive. The man who gave the false answer under oath kept his position and retired comfortably. 31. For 18 years, Americans were told the war in Afghanistan was making progress. Generals testified with confidence. Officials showed charts, metrics, territory maps, enemy body counts, and Afghan forces supposedly trained and ready. The message was always the same: the strategy is working, just give it more time. Then the Afghanistan Papers were published in 2019 based on internal government interviews obtained through Freedom of Information requests. The documents were brutal. Senior officials admitted they did not understand Afghanistan, did not have clear goals, and often used meaningless metrics to show success. Afghan army numbers were inflated. Corruption swallowed billions. Officials privately knew the war was failing while publicly describing progress. This was not one bad press conference. It was years of institutional optimism theater. Americans fought and died in a war their leaders repeatedly knew was not being honestly explained. The lie was not occasional. It became the management style. 32. On August 4, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson told the country that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had launched an unprovoked attack on the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson broad authority to expand the Vietnam War without a formal declaration. There was just one massive problem: the second attack did not happen. The earlier August 2nd incident was real, though tied to a tense context of covert U.S. operations. But the August 4th attack was a ghost story made of radar confusion, bad weather, nervous sonar readings, and sailors firing into empty water. Declassified NSA documents later confirmed officials had strong reason to doubt the attack almost immediately. Johnson pushed ahead anyway. The result was escalation, more than 58,000 American deaths, and millions of Vietnamese deaths. A war exploded from a phantom battle at sea. So yes, that was 32 government lies, cover-ups, propaganda stunts, and totally accidental truth accidents that aged like milk in a locked filing cabinet. Now I want the comments to get ugly in the best way. Which lie did we miss that absolutely deserved a spot here? Drop the one that still makes you furious. And if this video earned your suspicion, hit like and subscribe. Trust me, officially.